The rain fell upon London with the persistence of grief, transforming the cobblestones into mirrors that reflected a grey sky bereft of mercy. And in a modest townhouse on the unfashionable edge of Mayfair, Lady Eleanor Ashford stood before a Rain Street window and understood that her life, as she had known it, had come to an end. The room behind her bore the scars of genteel poverty, faded wallpaper that had once been fashionable. Furniture sold piece by piece until only the essential remained. The ghost marks on walls where paintings had hung before her father's creditors claimed them. She was 23 years old, possessed of a quiet beauty that went unnoticed in ballrooms where louder charms prevailed. Her dark hair pulled back in a simple arrangement, her grey silk dress turned twice and mended so carefully that only the most discerning eye would notice the repairs. The sound of carriage wheels on wet pavement drew her attention, and she watched as a vehicle of unmistakable quality halted before their door, black and gleaming even in the rain, drawn by horses that spoke of wealth beyond her family's faded memory of prosperity. Her father appeared in the doorway behind her, his face haggard with shame and desperation, the gambling debts that had consumed their fortune written in every line of his features. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice trembled with something that might have been remorse had it not been so thoroughly mixed with relief. "The Duke of Blackwood has arrived." She had heard the name whispered in parlours where she no longer received invitations. Adrian Thornfield, Duke of Blackwood, a man of 30 years, whose fortune was matched only by his reputation for cold calculation, who had buried 2 parents and never been seen to smile, whose grey eyes were said to freeze the blood of men who displeased him. The butler, one of the few servants they had retained, announced him with a formality that seemed absurd in their diminished circumstances, and then he was there in the doorway, tall and austere in perfectly tailored black, his features carved from some unforgiving stone, those legendary grey eyes sweeping the room with an assessment that missed nothing and forgave less. "Lady Eleanor," he said, and his voice was like winter wind through bare branches, "I have come to discuss a proposition that will resolve your father's debts entirely." She turned from the window to face him fully, reading in his expression a coldness that went beyond mere aristocratic reserve into something darker, something personal. He did not ask her to sit, did not observe the niceties that should govern such an interview, but spoke with the directness of a man conducting a transaction he found distasteful but necessary. "I require a wife," he stated, each word precise and calculated, "and you require rescue from circumstances that will otherwise see you reduced to poverty or worse. I will clear every debt your father owes, restore a modest income to your household in exchange for your hand in marriage." Eleanor felt the words strike her like physical blows, understanding immediately that this was no romantic proposal, but a business arrangement from which affection was deliberately excluded. Yet what choice did she possess when the alternative was ruin not just for herself, but for her father, for the servants who depended upon their household? "I accept," she said quietly, and saw something flicker in those grey eyes, satisfaction perhaps, or possibly something darker that she could not name. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in a chapel rendered cheerless by November rain. The ceremony attended by the minimum number of witnesses required by law, and her dress a simple cream silk that had belonged to her mother, his expression throughout as remote as if he were attending a funeral rather than his own wedding. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Adrian's kiss upon her hand was so brief and cold that Eleanor felt the chill of it long after, and as they departed the chapel into the grey morning, she caught one final glimpse of his eyes and saw there not love, not even indifference, but something that resembled hatred carefully banked like coals waiting to burst into flame, and she understood with terrible clarity that she had not been rescued at all, but rather claimed as payment for a debt she did not yet understand, bound to a man whose reasons for choosing her had nothing whatsoever to do with anything resembling affection or even basic human kindness. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. Thornfield Manor rose from the moorland like something conjured from a fevered imagination, all grey stone and sharp towers wreathed in mist that clung to its walls as if the house itself exhaled sorrow, and as Eleanor's carriage approached through the November gloom, she felt the weight of the place settle upon her shoulders like a physical burden. The journey from London had taken 2 days, and Adrian had ridden ahead on horseback, leaving her to travel alone with only a lady's maid for company, a circumstance that had told her more clearly than words what her position in this household would be. The servants assembled to greet her displayed the formal deference owed to a duchess, yet Eleanor caught the sidelong glances, the whispered exchanges quickly silenced, the unmistakable taint of pity in their expressions that spoke of a household well aware this was no love match, but something altogether more troubling. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bramwell, a woman of perhaps 50 years, with iron-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much to be easily deceived, conducted her through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly past portraits of Thornfield ancestors, whose painted eyes followed her progress with what seemed like accusation. "His Grace has assigned you the East Wing, Your Grace, Mrs." Bramwell said, and though her tone remained scrupulously neutral, Eleanor heard the significance in those words. The East Wing was as far from the Duke's apartments as one could be while remaining in the same house. The rooms themselves were beautiful in their way, furnished with obvious expense, yet possessing a coldness that no fire in the hearth could quite dispel, and Eleanor understood immediately that these were chambers designed not for comfort, but for isolation, a gilded cage dressed in silk and velvet. Adrian appeared at dinner, emerging from wherever he had sequestered himself since their arrival, and took his place at the head of the absurdly long dining table, while Eleanor sat so far distant that conversation would have required shouting. He addressed perhaps a dozen words to her throughout the meal, inquiries so perfunctory they barely qualified as courtesy, his attention fixed upon his plate or upon some middle distance that did not include her face. When the dessert course had been cleared, he stood abruptly, and without preamble delivered the pronouncement that would define her existence in this house. "I trust you will find your apartments adequate, madam," he said, his voice carrying the same chill she had heard in the chapel. "You need not concern yourself with the running of the household, as Mrs. Bramwell has managed these affairs for years and will continue to do so. I have business that will occupy me, and I expect you will find ways to occupy yourself that do not require my presence or attention. This is a marriage in name only, entered into for reasons of necessity, and you would do well to understand from the outset that I neither require nor desire anything resembling affection or companionship from this arrangement." Eleanor sat frozen in her chair as he departed without waiting for response or acknowledgement, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the cavernous dining room until even that faded into silence, leaving her alone with the servants who would not meet her eyes, and the terrible understanding that she had been brought to this Gothic fortress not as a wife but as a prisoner, claimed and confined for purposes she could not fathom, bound to a man whose hatred burned with such cold intensity that she felt its frost even in his absence. And that night, in her distant chambers with the mist pressing against the windows like seeking fingers, Eleanor wept, not for love lost, but for a future that stretched before her, as bleak and endless as the moors themselves. The truth came to Eleanor in fragments, pieces of a puzzle she had not known she was assembling, beginning 3 days after her arrival, when she descended the main staircase and heard voices drifting from the morning room. Mrs. Bramwell speaking in low tones to the butler about how tragic it was that His Grace had chosen this particular path for his revenge, how the late Duchess would have wept to see her son's heart so consumed by bitterness, and Eleanor had frozen on the stairs, her hand gripping the banister as the housekeeper continued, saying that of course Lord Ashford deserved punishment for what he had done, ruining the Duchess financially with his schemes and lies, contributing to her decline and death. But to marry the man's daughter and bind her to a loveless existence seemed a cruelty that served no one. Eleanor had continued to her rooms in silence, the words echoing in her mind like bells tolling for the dead, and over the following weeks she pieced together the full narrative through overheard conversations, through the sympathetic looks of servants who assumed she knew nothing, through the portrait she discovered in a closed gallery, a beautiful woman with sad eyes and Adrian's sharp features, the late Duchess of Blackwood, whose death had occurred 7 years prior, under circumstances that had left her son hollow and cold. She learned from the gardener, who spoke freely, believing her ignorant of the connection, that Lord Ashford had once been business partner to the late Duke, that he had embezzled funds and falsified accounts, that when the scheme collapsed, the Ashford family had fled to London, while the Thornfield family absorbed devastating losses, that the Duchess had sold her jewels and dismissed servants and worked herself to exhaustion, trying to preserve what remained, but that the shame and strain had broken her health until pneumonia claimed what grief had already weakened. Eleanor absorbed each detail with the stillness of someone watching their own execution, understanding with crystalline clarity that she had been chosen not despite being Lord Ashford's daughter, but precisely because of it, that every moment of coldness from Adrian was deliberate punishment, that her presence in this house served only to remind her father of his sins, while simultaneously ensuring that his daughter lived in the same loveless misery to which he had condemned Adrian's mother. She did not confront Adrian with this knowledge, for what would be the point when the truth was written in every cold glance and calculated distance, when her very existence here was intended as perpetual penance, and instead she retreated further into herself, spending long hours in the neglected corners of the estate where she need not encounter the man who had married her solely to make her suffer for crimes committed before she was old enough to understand them. In the darkness of her chambers that night, Eleanor wept, not from self-pity but from the terrible understanding that she was a pawn in a game that had begun before her birth, that her father's sins had been visited upon her in the form of this gilded prison, and that there existed no appeal from this sentence, no hope of pardon or reprieve, for how could one argue against revenge when the injury that prompted it had been real and devastating? When Adrian's mother had died, broken and impoverished, while her father lived on in comfortable disgrace, and Eleanor understood that she would spend the remainder of her days as living payment for a debt that could never truly be settled, bound to a man whose heart had turned to ice in the same cold ground where his mother lay buried. The weeks that followed took on the quality of a half-remembered dream, each day bleeding into the next with such monotonous similarity that Eleanor sometimes lost track of whether it was Tuesday or Thursday, morning or afternoon, as she navigated the vast emptiness of Thornfield Manor like a ghost haunting rooms that held no memory of her presence. She breakfasted alone in the small morning room where Mrs. Bramwell had arranged a place setting that seemed almost mockingly formal for a solitary diner, the silence broken only by the clink of silver against porcelain and the occasional creak of the house settling into itself, and afterward she would walk the gardens wrapped in her cloak against the November chill, following paths that wound through formal hedges and past fountains, where stone nymphs poured water into basins filled with ice. Adrian she glimpsed only in passing, a dark figure disappearing into his study or mounting his horse for rides across the moor, and on the rare occasions when their paths crossed in a corridor, he would offer the barest nod of acknowledgement before continuing on his way, treating her with less warmth than he showed the servants, less consideration than he granted the hounds that followed at his heels. The evenings she spent in the library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with books that smelled of leather and old paper and forgotten time, and it was there one afternoon that she discovered the portrait tucked into an alcove behind a heavy curtain, a woman rendered in oils with such skill that her eyes seemed to follow Eleanor as she stood transfixed before the canvas. The late Duchess had been beautiful, though beauty was perhaps too simple a word for features that spoke of intelligence and sadness in equal measure, the set of her mouth suggesting someone who had learned to bear disappointment with grace, and Eleanor saw in those painted eyes the same loneliness that greeted her each morning in her mirror, the same quiet resignation to a fate that offered no escape. She began to understand Adrian's face differently after that, seeing in his stern features an echo of his mother's sorrow, recognizing that the coldness he wielded like a weapon was itself a kind of armor against pain too deep for words, and though this understanding brought no comfort, it brought something else. A strange kinship with the woman in the portrait who had also suffered for another's sins and died alone in this great cold house. It was during one of her garden walks that Eleanor discovered the rose garden, or what remained of it, a walled enclosure behind the east wing where climbing roses had once covered trellises, but now grew wild and untended, canes crossing and recrossing in thorny tangles that choked out new growth, and something in the abandonment of this place called to her own sense of being forgotten and overlooked. She began spending her afternoons there, first simply sitting on the stone bench weathered grey by years of neglect, then slowly, tentatively, beginning to prune away the dead wood and train the living canes back along their supports, finding in this quiet work a purpose that asked nothing of her but presence and patience, creating beauty, not for anyone's approval, but simply because beauty deserved to exist, even in places where no one might see it. And as December approached and the first snow dusted the moors, Eleanor had cleared one entire section of the garden, revealing beneath the chaos the bones of something that had once been lovely and might, with time and care, be lovely again. The storm arrived on a December evening, with the kind of violence that transforms the moor into something primordial and threatening. Wind howling around the manor's stone walls like something alive and hungry, rain lashing the windows with such force that Eleanor could hear it even in the library, where she had retreated after dinner, the fire crackling in the hearth providing small comfort against the fury outside. She had been reading for perhaps an hour when the door opened and Adrian entered, his dark hair slightly disheveled as though he had just come in from the weather, and for a moment they simply stared at each other with the awkwardness of strangers forced into unexpected proximity, before he crossed to the sideboard and poured himself a brandy without offering explanation for his presence in a room he surely knew she occupied each evening. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the storm's rage and the occasional pop of burning wood, until Eleanor spoke first, her voice soft but clear. "The weather is quite terrible," she said, and immediately felt foolish for such an obvious observation, but Adrian merely nodded and took the chair opposite hers, close enough to the fire that the light played across his features and softened the harsh lines that usually marked his face. They sat without speaking for long minutes, the storm providing excuse for their mutual silence, until lightning illuminated the room in stark white brilliance, followed by thunder so close the windows rattled in their frames, and Eleanor flinched despite herself, her book sliding from her lap to the floor. Adrian rose and retrieved it, their fingers brushing briefly as he handed it back to her, and perhaps it was the storm's wildness that loosened something in both of them, or perhaps it was simply exhaustion, with the careful dance of avoidance they had maintained for weeks. But when he sat down again, he said, "You need not fear the storm. The manor has stood through worse." "I do not fear it," Eleanor replied, surprising herself with the honesty that followed. "I find it almost comforting in its honesty, the way it makes no pretense of being anything other than what it is." Something flickered in Adrian's grey eyes, recognition perhaps, or surprise, and he studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "You have known storms of your own, I think." It was not a question but an observation, and Eleanor found herself responding with more candor than she had shown anyone in months. Speaking of her mother's death, when Eleanor was barely 14, of the slow dissolution of their family, as her father's debts mounted and creditors circled like vultures, of the isolation that came from being the daughter of a man whose name had become synonymous with disgrace, and as she spoke, she saw Adrian listening with an intensity that suggested he was truly hearing her, not as an instrument of revenge, but as a person whose suffering was separate from, and perhaps equal to his own. When she finished speaking, the silence that fell between them was different from before, less hostile and more contemplative, and Adrian's voice when he finally spoke held a roughness that might have been emotion. "I too have known loss," he said simply, and though he did not elaborate, Eleanor understood he spoke of his mother, and for that moment, suspended in the storm's fury, they were not duke and unwilling duchess, not instruments of each other's punishment, but simply two people who had learned too young that the world was capable of terrible cruelty. But then something seemed to catch in Adrian, some internal warning that he had strayed too far from his carefully maintained distance, and Eleanor watched as his expression shuttered closed, the brief warmth in his eyes replaced by familiar ice as he stood abruptly and bid her a formal goodnight, leaving her alone with the storm and the ghost of what might have been a beginning, though neither of them could have known then that something had indeed shifted, some infinitesimal crack appearing in the wall between them that no amount of renewed coldness could entirely seal. The days after the storm resumed their familiar pattern, yet Eleanor found herself unable to return entirely to her former solitude, something in that brief moment of shared humanity having awakened in her a small, stubborn hope that perhaps kindness might accomplish what resignation could not, and so she began leaving small gestures in her wake, like seeds planted in uncertain soil, asking nothing in return but unable to stop herself from trying. In the library where she spent her evenings, she discovered several volumes whose spines had cracked or pages had come loose, books on philosophy and history that bore the marks of frequent reading, and with needle and thread borrowed from the housekeeper, she carefully repaired them, her stitches small and neat, restoring them to wholeness and returning them to their shelves before Adrian might notice her interference. She learned from Mrs. Bramwell that the Duke preferred his tea prepared in a particular way, strong and without sugar, served in the Chinese porcelain cup that had belonged to his mother, and though Eleanor never took tea with him, she began ensuring that this cup was always clean and ready in the afternoon, when he typically retreated to his study, a small consideration that required nothing of her but attention to his comfort. The rose garden she continued to tend with quiet devotion, working her way through the tangled growth section by section, and she noticed that one wall of climbing roses grew directly outside the tall windows of Adrian's study, so she paid particular care to this area, pruning away the dead canes and training the living ones to follow the old iron framework, imagining how they might look in spring when the buds unfurled into bloom, a splash of color against the grey stone visible from his desk if he ever bothered to look. She asked for nothing, expected nothing, simply moved through the manor, leaving these small kindnesses behind her, like footprints in snow, not because she believed they would change anything, but because she had spent too many years in her father's house, watching kindness wither from disuse, and would not allow herself to become that hardened, that defeated, even in the face of Adrian's determined coldness. And Adrian noticed, though he refused to acknowledge it even to himself at first, found himself drawn to the library to discover which books had been mended, running his fingers along spines that no longer bore the scars of age, found his tea waiting precisely as he preferred it, though he had never expressed this preference to his wife, found his gaze drifting to the windows, where winter light caught on branches, being slowly, patiently restored to order. He told himself it meant nothing, these gestures, that Eleanor was simply occupying herself as any woman might in a house that offered little entertainment, that her presence in his life remained what it had always been, a necessary evil in service of justice for his mother's suffering, yet he could not stop himself from looking for evidence of her presence, could not prevent the small softening that occurred in his chest when he discovered a favorite volume repaired or saw through the frost-rimed glass the figure of his wife kneeling in the garden, her hands working among thorns without complaint, and though his pride kept him from speaking of these things, from offering thanks or acknowledgement, he found himself lingering near windows that overlooked her work, his stern features softening almost imperceptibly as he watched her tend to beauty that no one had asked her to create. And the wall he had built around his heart developed another crack, small but deepening, through which something dangerously like tenderness began, against all his intentions, to seep. The crisis arrived on a grey January morning when Mrs. Bramwell appeared at Eleanor's sitting room with unusual agitation etched across her weathered features, her hands twisting in her apron, as she explained that young Mary, one of the scullery maids, had been accused of stealing a silver candlestick from the dining room, that the head butler, Mr. Carson, had discovered it missing during inventory and had found it hidden in Mary's quarters, and that the Duke was being summoned to pass judgment, as was his right as master of the household. Eleanor's first instinct was to remain apart from household matters that did not concern her, yet something in Mrs. Bramwell's distressed expression and the remembered image of Mary, a slight girl of perhaps 16 with frightened eyes, who had once thanked Eleanor profusely for a kind word, compelled her to rise and make her way to the servants' hall, where the household had gathered in tense silence. She arrived to find Mary standing before Adrian, the girl's face pale and streaked with tears, her thin body trembling as she protested her innocence, while Mr. Carson stood rigid with indignation, insisting that the evidence was irrefutable and that theft could not be tolerated regardless of the girl's protestations. And Adrian's expression was stern and remote as he prepared to render a verdict that would likely see Mary dismissed without reference and possibly handed to the magistrate. Eleanor stepped forward before she could reconsider the wisdom of interference, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the hushed room. "Your Grace, might I speak with Mary privately before judgment is passed?" Adrian's eyes met hers with surprise that quickly hardened into something like warning, as though reminding her that she had no authority in his household. Yet Eleanor held his gaze with a steadiness, born not of defiance but of conviction, that justice required more than surface evidence. And after a long moment he gave a curt nod of assent. In the small anteroom, Eleanor sat across from the trembling girl and spoke gently, asking not about guilt or innocence, but about Mary's daily routine, her duties, who had access to her quarters, and as the girl's terror gradually eased in the face of Eleanor's calm attention, a different story emerged: that Mary shared quarters with another maid, that this other girl had been courting Mr. Carson's nephew and had been recently spurned, that Mary had noticed items appearing in their shared space that she had not brought there but had been too frightened to mention, lest she be thought a thief. Eleanor's mind worked through the implications with a clarity that surprised her, seeing the shape of a scheme designed to punish through proxy, and she returned to the servants' hall with Mary beside her and a request that the other maid's quarters be searched, a suggestion that was met with Mr. Carson's blustering objections, until Adrian, who had been watching Eleanor with an intensity she could feel like heat against her skin, ordered it done. What they discovered confirmed Eleanor's suspicions: other items of silver hidden in places that suggested deliberate staging, and under careful questioning the other maid's composure crumbled into confession, admitting she had taken the items and hidden them in Mary's belongings out of spite for imagined slights, her face twisted with malice that dissolved into tears when Adrian pronounced her immediate dismissal. In the aftermath, as the household dispersed in whispers of shock and relief, Adrian approached Eleanor in the empty hall, and for the first time since their wedding day he truly looked at her, seeing not the daughter of his enemy, but a woman of unexpected wisdom and compassion, who had pursued truth with patience and insight, where others had accepted easy answers. And though he spoke only the formal words, "You showed considerable judgment in this matter, Your Grace." Eleanor heard beneath them something that might have been the beginning of respect, perhaps even wonder that she was so remarkably unlike the person he had assumed her to be. And as she met his eyes, she saw the first genuine crack in his perception of her, the moment when she ceased to be merely her father's daughter and became, impossibly, herself. Autumn arrived at Thornfield Manor with its usual melancholy splendor, the gardens transforming into a tapestry of amber and crimson, and Adrian found himself standing at his study window far more frequently than duty required, his eyes inevitably drawn to the figure of his wife as she walked the gravel paths or knelt among the rose beds that had flourished under her patient care. And each time he caught himself in this observation, he felt a surge of self-loathing that warred with something far more dangerous and unwelcome. He told himself it was merely curiosity, this tendency to note when Eleanor appeared in the gardens, to observe how the autumn light caught in her dark hair, or how she paused to examine the last roses before frost claimed them. But the lies grew thinner with each repetition, until even his formidable pride could not sustain them, and he was forced to acknowledge that he sought her presence the way a man dying of thirst seeks water, instinctively and with increasing desperation. The revenge he had planned with such cold precision seemed now like a relic from another man's life. The satisfactions he had anticipated, her unhappiness, her regret, her slow understanding that she was paying for her father's sins, had transformed into ashes in his mouth, because the woman he had married bore no resemblance to the creature of his imagination, and he found himself despising not Eleanor but his own blindness in believing that one person's sins could be visited justly upon another. At night he lay awake, cataloguing her virtues as though they were evidence in a trial against himself, her quiet dignity in the face of his cruelty, her patient kindness to servants who had expected her to be haughty, her resilience in creating beauty and purpose in a house that offered her nothing but isolation, and most damning of all, the complete absence of bitterness or complaint despite having every right to both. He watched her navigate her lonely existence with a grace that shamed him, observed how she never sought his attention or approval, yet continued to extend small courtesies that he had done nothing to earn, and he understood with growing horror that he had shackled himself to a form of torment far worse than any he had intended for her. He had bound himself to a woman he was coming to admire, perhaps even to love, while maintaining the pretense that she meant nothing to him, that this marriage was merely the satisfying conclusion to a long-nursed grievance. The war within him intensified with each passing day, his carefully constructed justifications crumbling against the evidence of Eleanor's character, and he found himself in the unprecedented position of longing for the company of someone he had vowed to make miserable, seeking opportunities to encounter her in the halls or library, while simultaneously avoiding any genuine interaction that might reveal the dangerous shift in his sentiments. He despised himself for this weakness, railed against it in the privacy of his thoughts, reminded himself of his mother's suffering and his sacred duty to exact payment for it. Yet none of these mental fortifications could prevent the softening that occurred each time he saw Eleanor pause to speak kindly to a servant or discovered another small gesture she had left in her wake, and he began to suspect with dawning dread that the revenge he had so carefully orchestrated had failed entirely, had perhaps even inverted itself, leaving him the prisoner of feelings he had never intended to develop for a woman he had married only to punish, and the realization that he might actually be falling in love with his own instrument of vengeance filled him with a self-directed fury that made his earlier coldness seem almost gentle by comparison. The fever came suddenly in the night, transforming Eleanor from her usual composed self into a figure of delirium and trembling weakness, and when Mrs. Bramwell discovered her the following morning, barely conscious and burning with heat that seemed to radiate from her very bones, the housekeeper's alarm brought Adrian running to Eleanor's chambers with a speed that surprised even himself, and the sight of his wife so diminished, her face flushed crimson against the white pillows and her breath coming in shallow gasps, struck him with a terror he had not felt since watching his mother decline years before. He summoned the physician immediately, dismissed the man's reassurances with barely controlled fury, when the doctor could offer nothing more than the standard remedies of cool cloths and thyme, and then, to the astonishment of the household staff, the Duke took up residence in the chair beside Eleanor's bed and refused to leave, despite propriety and Mrs. Bramwell's gentle suggestions that such vigils were better left to nurses. For 3 days and nights, Adrian maintained his watch, sleeping only in fitful intervals when exhaustion overtook him, bathing Eleanor's fevered brow with his own hands, and listening with increasing anguish to the words that spilled from her in moments of delirium, fragments about loneliness and cold halls, and wishes that she might have been worthy of kindness and confessions of hope she had not dared speak aloud, and longings for a connection that seemed forever beyond her reach. And each word fell upon Adrian's conscience like a stone, building a monument to his own cruelty that he could no longer ignore or justify. He found himself speaking to her unconscious form, saying things he had never permitted himself to say in her hearing, apologies and admissions that felt inadequate against the magnitude of what he had done to her, and in those dark hours he understood with crystalline clarity that somewhere in the months of her patient endurance and quiet grace, he had fallen irretrievably in love with the woman he had married to punish, that the thought of losing her now filled him with a desperation that made his previous suffering seem trivial by comparison. On the third night, when her fever finally broke and she opened her eyes with something like recognition, focusing on his face with confusion that gradually transformed into wonder as she whispered, "You stayed." Adrian felt tears he had not shed since childhood threatened to fall, and he took her hand with a gentleness that contradicted everything their marriage had been thus far. Unable to speak past the constriction in his throat, but hoping she might somehow understand in his touch what he could not yet say aloud. Eleanor's recovery was slow, her strength returning in gradual increments, and Adrian found himself unable to return to his former coldness, appearing at her door with books he thought might interest her, ensuring her meals were prepared to her preferences, sitting beside her bed in companionable silence that felt nothing like the isolation that had defined their previous months together. And though pride and shame still prevented him from confessing the truth of his transformed heart, he knew that something fundamental had shifted between them, in that the walls he had so carefully constructed had crumbled during those 3 days of terror when he had faced the possibility of her death and understood too late what she had come to mean to him, but what she had perhaps always meant, despite his determination to deny it. The evening Adrian first appeared at the dining room for dinner, Eleanor looked up from her solitary meal with such undisguised surprise that he felt shame burn through him at how thoroughly he had trained her to expect nothing from him, and though his initial invitation that they dine together was delivered with characteristic terseness, something in his expression made her set down her fork and nod her acceptance. And so began a ritual that transformed the cavernous dining hall from a monument to isolation into something that resembled, however tentatively, companionship. Their first shared meals were exercises in careful navigation, conversations stilted and formal as they circled around safe topics, the quality of the harvest, repairs needed on the east wing, the unseasonably warm weather. But Eleanor noticed how Adrian's rigid posture gradually relaxed as weeks passed, how his responses grew less clipped and more considered, and she found herself responding with cautious warmth that she hardly dared acknowledge even to herself, afraid that this thawing might prove as temporary as spring frost. They discovered shared opinions on books, Eleanor mentioning her admiration for Wordsworth's contemplation of nature, and Adrian surprising her by quoting entire passages from memory, his voice taking on an uncharacteristic softness as he spoke of finding solace in poetry during his mother's final illness. And this small revelation, this crack in his carefully maintained facade, emboldened Eleanor to share her own experiences of grief, how she had turned to books when her mother died because the written word demanded nothing of her but attention. And in these exchanges, something fragile and precious began to grow between them, a mutual recognition of shared wounds beneath their different circumstances. Small moments accumulated like interest on an investment. Eleanor had not known she was making Adrian's hand at her elbow as they ascended the grand staircase after dinner, his touch brief but steady, and somehow speaking of concern rather than mere courtesy. The way he began selecting volumes from the library and leaving them in her sitting room with small notes about passages he thought might interest her. His presence in the garden as she tended her roses, initially standing at a distance but gradually drawing closer until he was handing her pruning shears or asking questions about her techniques that suggested genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. Eleanor found herself laughing at his dry observations about estate management and local society, discovering beneath his severity a wit that was sharp but never cruel, and the sound of her own laughter seemed to surprise them both, filling spaces in Thornfield Manor that had known only silence and creating echoes that felt almost like happiness, or at least like its distant possibility. The silences between them transformed as well, losing their quality of isolation and taking on instead a companionable ease that Eleanor had not experienced since her mother's death. The moments when they sat in the library with their separate books, yet somehow together in a way that required no words, and she caught herself studying Adrian's profile in the firelight, noting how the harsh lines of his face softened in contemplation, how his hands so often clenched in what she had once thought was anger, but now recognized as his own form of restraint, relaxed when he believed himself unobserved, and she felt hope unfurling in her chest like those roses she had coaxed back to life, fragile and easily damaged, but stubbornly persistent in its determination to bloom despite the inhospitable soil from which it grew. The resolution formed in Adrian's mind during a sleepless night when moonlight fell across Eleanor's empty chair in the library, and he understood with painful clarity that he could no longer continue this deception, that the foundation of their growing connection was built upon lies he had constructed and she had never been told. And he determined that he would confess everything, the calculated revenge that had motivated their marriage, the gradual transformation of his heart, the love that now consumed him with an intensity that made his previous hatred seem pale and insubstantial by comparison. But when morning came and he found Eleanor in the conservatory tending to seedlings she was coaxing into life, the words died in his throat as he watched her gentle hands work the soil, and shame crashed over him like a wave, drowning his courage in the recognition of how thoroughly he had wronged this woman who had shown him nothing but quiet dignity in the face of his cruelty. He tried again during their evening meal, the confession forming and reforming in his mind as he watched her speak of a letter from a distant cousin, her face animated in a way it had not been when she first arrived at Thornfield Manor, and he opened his mouth to speak the truth, but heard himself instead asking about her opinion on expanding the rose gardens, the cowardice of his substitution burning in his chest, even as Eleanor's eyes lit with surprised pleasure at his interest in her project. Each day brought new attempts and new failures, moments when the truth pressed against his teeth like something physical demanding release. But always the same paralyzing question stopped him. How could he confess to marrying her for vengeance when she sat beside him in the library, reading aloud passages from novels that moved her, when she laughed at his observations with genuine delight, when she had begun to look at him with something that resembled trust and perhaps even the earliest seeds of affection, and would not his confession shatter whatever fragile thing was growing between them, replacing the warmth they had cultivated with the frost of betrayal? The weight of his deception grew heavier even as their connection deepened, a crushing pressure that accompanied every shared moment and transformed his joy in her presence into something bittersweet and aching, and Adrian found himself caught in an impossible position, unable to move forward into true intimacy, while this fundamental lie remained unspoken, yet unable to speak it for fear of destroying the only happiness he had ever known. He studied Eleanor across the dinner table, memorizing the way candlelight caught in her dark hair and softened the angles of her face, the way her hands moved when she spoke of things that mattered to her, the particular quality of her smile when something genuinely amused her, rather than merely requiring polite acknowledgement. And he thought that surely she deserved to know the truth of what had brought her to Thornfield Manor, that she deserved the choice of whether to remain, once she understood the calculated cruelty that had begun their union. Yet each time he gathered his courage to confess, he imagined the light dying in her eyes and found himself choosing silence once more, postponing the inevitable reckoning and hating himself for the postponement, even as he could not seem to stop making it. Day after day after day, Eleanor had been returning from the rose garden with soil still dark beneath her fingernails when she heard voices from Adrian's study, the door standing slightly ajar in a way that would have meant nothing to her months ago, but now drew her attention because she had learned the rhythms of this house and knew that Adrian always closed doors when conducting business, and she might have continued past without pause, except that she heard her own name spoken in Adrian's voice with a particular tension that made her steps slow, despite her better judgment. She stood in the corridor with her basket of cut roses growing heavy in her hands as Adrian's solicitor, a thin man named Morrison who visited quarterly, said something about the original terms of the arrangement, and then Adrian's response came clear and cold in a tone she had not heard him use in weeks. "The purpose has been served, Morrison. You need not concern yourself with the particulars," and the solicitor's reply about completing the legal documentation and finalizing matters struck Eleanor like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs as understanding crashed over her with the force of winter wind. She understood then, or believed she understood, with a clarity that made her earlier happiness seem like the foolish delusion of a desperate woman who had mistaken kindness for affection and companionship for something deeper, that Adrian had married her for revenge as she had always known, that these recent months of warmth and shared dinners and gentle touches had been nothing more than the civilized conclusion to his calculated cruelty, and now that his purpose was served, now that he had sufficiently punished her for her father's sins, by giving her a taste of what marriage might have been before taking it away, he was making arrangements to end what had never truly been a marriage at all. The roses slipped from her nerveless fingers and scattered across the marble floor in a spray of crimson and white. But Eleanor did not stop to gather them as she walked with careful dignity toward the stairs, each step requiring conscious thought because her body had gone numb and distant as though she were observing herself from a great height. And she thought with bitter clarity that the pain of this moment was worse than anything she had endured in the early days of their marriage, because then she had expected nothing, and now she had committed the fatal error of hoping, of allowing herself to believe that perhaps she might be valued for herself rather than as an instrument of vengeance, of imagining that the man who quoted poetry to her over dinner and left books in her sitting room might have come to care for her as something more than a symbol of her father's debts. She reached her chambers and closed the door with a quiet click that seemed to echo through the empty rooms, and she stood with her back pressed against the carved wood as tears she had not permitted herself to shed in all the lonely months of her marriage finally spilled over, hot and bitter against her cheeks, because she had survived isolation and coldness and the knowledge that she was unwanted. But she could not survive this, the loss of something she had only just begun to believe might be real, the death of a future she had been foolish enough to imagine, the confirmation that she had been right from the beginning to expect nothing, because nothing was precisely what she would be allowed to keep. Eleanor woke the next morning with the clarity that comes after tears have been spent, and grief has settled into something harder and more resolute, a determination forged in the understanding that she would not remain at Thornfield Manor to be dismissed like a servant whose term of employment had ended, that she would not give Adrian the satisfaction of discarding her after he had accomplished whatever purpose her presence had served in his careful calculations of revenge. And she rose from her bed with movements that were deliberately calm and measured as she began the quiet work of dismantling the fragile life she had built within these walls. She started with her books, the volumes she had brought from her father's ruined library, and those Adrian had given her during the thawing of recent months. She wrapped each one carefully in brown paper, her hand steady despite the way her heart fractured anew. When she came to the poetry collection he had left in her sitting room only 3 days prior, with a particular passage marked in his precise handwriting, and she placed them in the trunk that had accompanied her to Thornfield Manor as a bride, thinking with bitter irony that she would leave with exactly what she had brought, no richer and infinitely poorer for the hope she had been foolish enough to cultivate. The letter proved more difficult than the packing, and Eleanor sat at her writing desk for nearly an hour with the blank page before her, knowing that she must strike precisely the right tone, neither accusatory nor pleading, neither angry nor pathetic, that she must release Adrian from their arrangement with the same dignity she had maintained throughout their marriage, giving him no reason to remember her with anything but perhaps the faintest shadow of regret that he had not appreciated what he had possessed while he possessed it. She wrote and rewrote the opening lines, discarding phrases that revealed too much hurt or too little pride, until finally she achieved the cool, formal tone she sought, writing that she understood the arrangement that had brought them together had served its purpose, that she released him from any further obligation to maintain the fiction of their marriage, that she would retire to the country cottage her mother's sister had left her and trouble him no more with her presence, and she thanked him with perfect politeness for the shelter he had provided and wished him well in his future endeavors, signing her name with a flourish that she hoped concealed the way her hand trembled as she sealed the letter with wax. She instructed her maid, young Annie, who had been kind to her from the beginning, to pack only what was truly hers, refusing to take anything that had been provided by Adrian or purchased with Thornfield funds, and Annie wept as she folded gowns and wrapped trinkets, asking in a small voice if there had been some terrible argument, if perhaps the Duchess might reconsider. But Eleanor touched the girl's shoulder with gentle finality and said only that some things were never meant to last, and one must know when to leave with grace rather than wait to be expelled with shame. The work of packing occupied her hands but not her mind, and as Eleanor wrapped the small watercolor she had painted of the rose garden in its spring glory, she permitted herself one moment of grieving for the future. She had imagined the children she had begun to picture running through Thornfield's halls, the years of companionship growing deeper and richer, the possibility that she might have been loved for herself rather than despised for her father's sins. And then she placed the painting in the trunk and closed that particular door of hope with the same decisive finality with which she would soon close the door of Thornfield Manor behind her, knowing that her heartbreak must remain private and her determination absolute, that she would leave at dawn and never look back at what might have been. Adrian had been in his study, reviewing correspondence that held no meaning to him, the words blurring on the page as his mind returned again and again to the conversation he must have with Eleanor, the confession that grew more impossible with each passing hour, when he noticed through the window a carriage being prepared in the courtyard at an unusual hour, and something in the careful way the servants moved their sidelong glances toward the east wing sent a cold dread sliding through his chest that propelled him from his chair and up the stairs with a speed that would have seemed undignified had he cared for dignity in that moment. And he arrived at Eleanor's chambers to find Annie directing footmen with trunks, her eyes red-rimmed and her face set in the particular expression of someone trying very hard not to weep. And when she saw him, she curtsied with trembling hands and said in a voice barely above a whisper that the Duchess had given instructions for her departure at first light. The words struck Adrian with the force of a physical blow, driving him past the threshold into Eleanor's sitting room, where he found evidence of systematic dismantling, the books gone from their shelves, the small watercolors removed from the walls, the embroidery frame that usually sat by the window conspicuously absent, and on the writing desk he saw the letter, his name written in Eleanor's careful script on the folded paper that seemed to pulse with terrible significance in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. He took it up with hands that had negotiated fortunes and signed documents that moved thousands of pounds without tremor, but now shook like leaves in winter wind. And as he read her words, so carefully composed, so perfectly polite, so absolutely final, he felt the architecture of his entire existence crumbling beneath him. Each phrase another stone pulled from the foundation until he stood in the ruins of his own making, his understanding with devastating clarity that she believed he wanted her gone, that she thought the arrangement had served its purpose, that she was releasing him from obligations he had never felt more bound by in his life. The carefully constructed revenge that had consumed him for years revealed itself in that moment as the pathetic delusion it had always been. He had married her to punish her for her father's sins, to bind her to a loveless existence as payment for debts that were not hers to bear. But somewhere in the months of her quiet grace and accumulated kindnesses, in the evenings of shared conversation and the small moments of laughter that had crept into the spaces between his carefully maintained coldness, and he had fallen so completely in love with her that the thought of losing her now was agony beyond anything his revenge had ever intended to inflict. And he saw with terrible irony that he had succeeded only in destroying himself, that his carefully laid plans had transformed not her into a prisoner of misery, but himself into a man who could not imagine drawing breath in a world that did not contain her presence. He read the letter again, searching for some hint of anger or accusation that might have given him something to combat. But there was only her dignified acceptance and gracious release, and he understood that she was doing what she had always done, bearing her pain with quiet strength, asking nothing, expecting nothing, giving him every opportunity to let her go without impediment or shame, and the realization that he had taught her so thoroughly to expect nothing from him, that he had been so successful in his cruelty that she could not even imagine he might want her to stay, filled him with a self-loathing so profound that he crumpled the letter in his fist and stood in the center of her emptying rooms, knowing that he had perhaps hours, perhaps only minutes, before she was gone forever, and with her any possibility of redemption, any chance of becoming the man her grace had slowly been transforming him into, any hope of a future that held meaning beyond the cold satisfaction of revenge that had already turned to ashes in his mouth. Adrian found Eleanor in the library where she had gone to retrieve the final volumes she had left there, and books they had discussed together on evenings that now seemed to belong to another lifetime. And when she turned at the sound of his footsteps, her face composed itself into the careful neutrality she had perfected during their months of cold matrimony. That expression that revealed nothing and protected everything, and he felt the words he had rehearsed dissolve on his tongue as pride and fear warred within him, leaving him capable only of saying her name like a question he did not know how to ask. She regarded him with eyes that held no anger, no accusation, only a terrible weariness that was somehow worse than any fury could have been, and she said with perfect politeness that she hoped her departure would not cause him inconvenience, that she had arranged for the solicitor to handle all necessary documents, that he need not concern himself with her welfare, as she had modest means sufficient for a quiet life, and each word was a blade that cut him because they were the words of a stranger, the formal phrases of someone taking leave of a distant acquaintance, rather than the husband she had begun to trust. And Adrian understood that his coldness had taught her this language of distance, that he had been so successful in his cruelty that she could not imagine he might wish for her proximity rather than her absence. He tried to tell her she had misunderstood, that the conversation she had overheard with his solicitor had concerned entirely different matters, but the words came out wrong, tangled with his inability to confess the truth that lay beneath, that he had married her for revenge, that he had intended her suffering, that he had no right to ask her to stay now that she had decided to go. And Eleanor heard in his fumbling explanation only confirmation of what she already believed, that the arrangement had indeed run its course, that he was merely being polite in his dismissal, rather than brutally direct. She interrupted him with a raised hand, her voice steady despite the pain he could see flickering in the depths of her eyes, and she said that he need not spare her feelings with gentle falsehoods, that she understood perfectly well the nature of their marriage and harbored no illusions about its continuation, that she was grateful for the months of companionship they had shared, but recognized them now for what they were, a temporary softening that changed nothing of the fundamental reality between them. And Adrian felt something break inside him, in at her words, at the way she had taken his moments of genuine transformation and dismissed them as meaningless kindness, temporary aberrations in a relationship defined by its essential coldness. He wanted to seize her shoulders and shake her, to force her to see that those months had been the only real thing in his entire existence, that every moment of warmth between them had been more genuine than any part of the revenge that had brought them together. But pride held his hands at his sides, and shame stopped his throat, and instead he stood frozen as she turned back to her books, her movements deliberate and final, and he heard himself say in a voice that sounded foreign and distant that if she wished to leave, he would not prevent her, that she was free to go. And the moment the words left his mouth, he wanted to call them back, to unsay them, to fall to his knees and beg her to stay. But she had already nodded once, that small gesture of acknowledgement that felt like a door closing, and she said she would depart at dawn, her voice barely above a whisper, and Adrian stood paralyzed in the library doorway as she gathered her books and walked past him, close enough that he could smell the lavender she wore, could see the tears she was fighting to contain, close enough to touch but impossibly far beyond his reach, and he watched her disappear up the stairs to her chambers, heard the quiet click of her door closing, and understood with devastating certainty that he had just committed the greatest failure of his life, that pride and fear had conspired to rob him of the words that might have changed everything, that he would spend the remaining hours until dawn trapped in the hell of his own making, knowing that the woman he loved believed herself unwanted and was preparing to walk out of his life forever, while he stood silent and useless, a prisoner of the revenge that had become his own punishment. Adrian did not return to his chambers that night, but remained in his study where the fire had burned low, and the shadows stretched long across walls that had witnessed his transformation from vengeful son to broken man, and as the clock marked each hour with mechanical precision, he sat motionless in the leather chair that had been his father's. Then his, facing squarely for the first time in his life, the architecture of choices that had brought him to this precipice, where everything he had never known he wanted stood poised to vanish with the dawn. He saw with pitiless clarity the young man he had been when his mother died, consumed by grief that had curdled into rage, needing someone to blame for the loss that had unmade his world. And when he learned of Lord Ashford's role in the financial ruin that had broken his mother's health and hastened her death, he had seized upon that knowledge, like a drowning man clutches debris, had built his entire identity around the promise of revenge, had spent years planning this marriage that would bind Ashford's daughter to a lifetime of cold neglect as payment for sins that were not hers to bear. The revenge had seemed righteous then, just, the only possible response to the wound that would not heal, but now in the darkness of this final night, he understood that he had been poisoning himself, that every moment spent nurturing his hatred had been a moment stolen from the possibility of genuine life, that he had become so enamored with his own suffering that he had mistaken vengeance for purpose and cruelty for strength. Eleanor had entered his carefully constructed hell with nothing but quiet dignity, had absorbed his coldness without complaint, had tended abandoned gardens and repaired torn books, and shown kindness to servants and asked absolutely nothing in return. And somewhere in the accumulation of those small graces, she had begun dismantling the fortress he had built around his heart, brick by brick, rose by rose, until he had found himself seeking her presence, not because revenge required it, but because her company had become the only thing that made the vast emptiness of Thornfield Manor feel remotely like a home. He remembered the evening of the storm when they had first truly spoken, the way her voice had trembled slightly as she confessed her own losses, and he remembered the shame that had flooded him when he realized he had been so consumed with his own grief that he had never considered hers, had never thought to ask what it cost her to be bartered like property, to pay for her father's debts, to be married to a man whose eyes held nothing but ice, to navigate each day in a house where she was tolerated but not wanted. The illness had stripped away his final pretenses, those 3 days of vigil when he had bathed her fevered brow and listened to her delirious whispers about loneliness and unworthiness, had shown him a truth he could no longer deny, that he loved her with an intensity that made his years of planned revenge seem like the pathetic machinations of a child, that the thought of a world without her presence was unendurable, that she had become not his victim but his salvation, the only person who had ever seen past his carefully maintained coldness to the broken boy beneath, and had responded not with pity but with grace. And yet pride, that damned pride that had sustained him through years of isolation, had kept him from speaking the words that might have changed everything, had convinced him that confession was weakness, that admitting his transformation was somehow a betrayal of his mother's memory. And now that same pride had led Eleanor to believe she was unwanted, when the truth was that she had become the very center of his existence, the axis around which everything else turned, and he was about to lose her because he had been too much a coward to kneel before her and speak plainly what his heart had been screaming for months. As the first grey light of dawn began to creep through the study windows, Adrian rose from his chair with the weight of absolute clarity settling over him like armor, understanding that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford, that redemption required the courage to stand naked before the person you had wronged and offer truth without defense or justification. And he knew with perfect certainty what he must do, even if it cost him every shred of dignity he possessed, even if she refused him, even if the household witnessed his humiliation, because the alternative, a life without Eleanor, was no life at all but merely existence, and he had spent too many years existing in the cold shadow of revenge to accept that fate, now that he had glimpsed what living might truly mean. Dawn broke pale and hesitant over Thornfield Manor as Eleanor descended the main staircase for the final time, her traveling cloak already fastened, her gloves drawn on, her face composed into the careful mask of dignity that had sustained her through so many months of loneliness. And the household staff had gathered in the entrance hall with expressions that ranged from pity to sorrow, for in the months she had lived among them, she had earned their affection through small kindnesses they had not forgotten, and her trunk stood waiting by the door like sentinels marking the end of something that had never quite been allowed to begin. She was giving final instructions to Mrs. Hartwell about forwarding any remaining correspondence when the study door opened and Adrian emerged, and Eleanor felt her carefully constructed composure waver at the sight of him, his face haggard with sleeplessness, his eyes red-rimmed, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled in a way that suggested he had not even attempted rest. But she steeled herself and turned back to Mrs. Hartwell, determined to complete her departure with whatever shreds of dignity remained to her. She heard his footsteps cross the marble floor and stopped walking, expecting some final polite farewell, some formal acknowledgement that their arrangement had concluded. But when she turned at the sound of her name on his lips, she found him not standing at a respectful distance as propriety demanded, but moving toward her with an expression of such raw desperation that it stopped the breath in her throat, and before she could comprehend his intention, before the assembled staff could react with anything more than shocked gasps, Adrian Thornfield, Duke of Blackwood, dropped to his knees before her on the cold marble floor of his ancestral home, his pride shattered and discarded like broken glass at her feet. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the sound of someone's strangled sob, and Eleanor stood frozen as Adrian looked up at her with eyes that held no trace of the ice that had defined their first meeting. Only a vulnerability so complete it was almost unbearable to witness, and when he spoke, his voice carried through the entrance hall with a clarity that ensured every servant, every witness to this unprecedented scene, would hear the words that cost him everything he had spent his life protecting. He confessed it all: how he had married her for revenge, how her father's actions had destroyed his mother, and he had sought to punish that sin by binding Eleanor to a lifetime of loveless matrimony, how he had intended her suffering as payment for debts that were never hers to bear. And the words fell from his lips like stones, each one a weight he had carried alone, each one an admission of cruelty that made Eleanor's hand fly to her mouth in horror, not at the revelation itself, which she had long suspected, but at hearing him strip away every pretense before witnesses who would carry this story beyond these walls, destroying his reputation with a thoroughness that spoke to how little he cared for anything beyond this moment, beyond her. But he did not stop with confession of his sins, he continued, his voice breaking now, to tell her how she had undone him, how her quiet grace had dismantled his revenge, piece by piece, until he no longer recognized the man he had been, how the roses she tended had bloomed in the wasteland of his heart, how her kindness to servants and her dignity in suffering and her willingness to find beauty in abandonment had shown him what love might look like if he were brave enough to reach for it. And he told her that he loved her with an intensity that terrified him, that the months of growing closeness had been the only honest thing in his entire existence, that he would spend the rest of his life earning her forgiveness if she would grant him the chance, but that if she chose to leave, he would not prevent her because she deserved freedom more than he deserved redemption. He asked for nothing, promised everything, promised honesty, promised partnership, promised to spend every remaining day proving himself worthy of the grace she had already shown him, and then he fell silent, still kneeling, his fate entirely in her hands, and Eleanor stood above him, trembling with emotions she could not name, aware of every eye upon them, aware that her next words would determine not just her own future, but whether redemption was possible for a man who had finally found the courage to kneel. Eleanor stood motionless in the entrance hall of Thornfield Manor, with her heart a battlefield where fury warred with compassion, betrayal with understanding, and the urge to flee with something deeper she could not yet name. And she looked down at the man, kneeling before her, this duke, who had built his life around revenge, who had married her as an instrument of punishment, who had treated her with calculated coldness for months, and saw not the monster she might have expected, but someone profoundly, devastatingly human in his brokenness. And the recognition of that humanity was perhaps the most painful gift he could have given her, because it meant she could not simply hate him, could not reduce him to villain and herself to victim, could not make this choice simple when everything in her wished desperately for simplicity. She remembered the first months at Thornfield when his coldness had been absolute, when she had walked these halls like a ghost haunting rooms where she was tolerated but not wanted, and the knowledge that this suffering had been deliberate, that he had orchestrated her loneliness as payment for sins that belonged to her father, filled her with a rage so pure it made her hands tremble, because she had done nothing to deserve such cruelty except be born to the wrong man. And he had punished her anyway, had made her pay for debts she had never incurred, and had stolen months of her life and dedicated them to vengeance against a girl who had already lost so much. But against that rage stood the evidence of transformation, the way his demeanor had shifted almost imperceptibly over autumn, the dinners where conversation had moved from stilted formality to genuine exchange, the moment his hand had steadied her on the stairs and lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary, the tenderness in his eyes during her illness, when he had thought she was too fevered to notice, the accumulated small kindnesses that had made her begin to hope that perhaps this cold marriage might thaw into something approaching partnership. And she understood now that those changes had been real, that the man who had sought her presence and made her laugh with dry wit and looked at her as though she mattered had not been performing a deception, but struggling against his own history to become someone capable of love. She thought of the roses she had tended in those abandoned gardens, how they had grown from neglected soil, how beauty could emerge from the most unlikely places if given patience and care, and she wondered whether the same might be true of love, whether something genuine could take root in ground poisoned by revenge if both parties had the courage to nurture it. And the question that consumed her now was not whether he had wronged her, that was undeniable, but whether redemption was possible, whether people could truly transform, whether the man kneeling before her with tears on his face and his pride shattered at her feet was the same man who had married her for vengeance, or someone who had been remade through the very grace he had sought to deny her. The servants watched in breathless silence, and Eleanor felt the weight of her choice pressing down like a physical thing, understanding that if she walked through those doors, she would be choosing safety over possibility, protection over risk, and perhaps that would be the wise choice, and the choice any sensible woman would make. But she had spent so many months being sensible, being dignified, being alone, and she was so very tired of choosing only what was safe when her heart was pulling her towards something far more dangerous and infinitely more real. And as she looked into Adrian's eyes and saw the man he had become warring with the man he had been, Eleanor understood that her choice would determine not just her own future, but whether redemption was merely a pretty word or something that could actually transform the landscape of two broken lives into ground where love might finally, against all odds, take root and grow. Eleanor's voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet but steady, carrying through the entrance hall with a clarity that made every servant hold their breath, and she said, "Rise, your grace," and watched as Adrian looked up at her with something like hope warring with despair in his eyes, and she continued, "I will not leave Thornfield Manor today," and the collective exhalation from the assembled staff was audible. But Eleanor raised her hand because she was not finished, and she needed him to understand that her staying was not the same as absolution, that forgiveness was not a gift she could bestow in a single moment, but a territory they would have to map together through honest navigation of all the pain that lay between them. And she told him that they would begin again, truly begin, with no pretenses and no secrets, building something real from the ruins of what had been broken, but that this would take time and effort, and a willingness from both of them to be more courageous than either had yet proven themselves to be. The weeks that followed were unlike anything that had come before because they moved through Thornfield as two people learning each other for the first time, and Adrian kept his promise of honesty with a thoroughness that sometimes made Eleanor's heart ache. He told her of his mother's final days, of the bitterness that had consumed him, and of the moments during their marriage when her kindness had cracked his resolve, and he had hated himself for softening. And Eleanor in turn shared her own truths, the loneliness of her childhood after her mother's death, her father's descent into gambling, the shame of being bartered like property. And these conversations were not easy or comfortable, but they were real, and reality was what they had lacked from the beginning. Spring arrived and found them walking the gardens together in the afternoons, not touching but present to one another in ways that would have been impossible months before. And Adrian asked her opinion on estate matters and actually listened to her responses, implemented her suggestions about the tenant farms. And Eleanor discovered that beneath his aristocratic reserve lay a mind that delighted in debate, and a humor so dry it took her weeks to recognize when he was jesting. And she found herself laughing in ways she had not since her mother lived, and found herself seeking his company, not from duty, but from genuine desire, to hear his thoughts on the book she was reading or the roses that were beginning to bloom again in gardens they now tended together. Summer brought the first touch accidental at first, his hand brushing hers as they reached for the same volume in the library, and the electricity of that contact made them both freeze, made Eleanor's breath catch and Adrian's eyes darken with want. He no longer tried to hide, but he did not presume, did not push, only waited until one evening when they sat in the drawing room and she reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand deliberately in his, and his fingers closed around hers with a tenderness that spoke of how much that simple gesture meant, how far they had traveled to reach this moment of chosen connection. Autumn arrived, and with it a deepening conversations that lasted until the fire burned to embers, shared silences that felt like companionship rather than isolation, the first tentative endearments that felt earned rather than obligatory, and the night Adrian told her he loved her again, not kneeling this time but standing before her in the library, where they had spent so many evenings rebuilding what revenge had nearly destroyed. Eleanor found the words rising in her own throat and surprising her with their truth, because somewhere in the slow accumulation of honest moments, she had discovered that love was not the lightning strike of fairy tales, but the patient cultivation of trust, and she loved him not despite what he had been, but because of who he had chosen to become. And when she spoke those words, his expression transformed into something so full of gratitude and wonder that she understood he had never truly believed she would reach this point, had been prepared to spend a lifetime earning something he thought would forever remain beyond his grasp. Winter found them truly married at last, not in the legal sense that had bound them from the beginning, but in the deeper covenant of two people who had chosen each other after seeing the worst each had to offer, and their love was not the pristine thing of romance novels, but something harder and more valuable, forged in the crucible of failure and redemption. And when Adrian held her in the darkness of their shared chambers, he whispered apologies she no longer needed to hear, because his every action spoke of changed heart. And Eleanor understood that they had both been transformed by this unlikely journey, that the girl who had accepted a loveless marriage and the man who had orchestrated it as revenge had both died to make room for these new selves, who understood that the most profound love was not given easily, but earned through the daily choice to be honest, to be present, to be brave enough to build something beautiful from the most damaged and unlikely soil. 5 years had passed since that day in the entrance hall when Eleanor chose to stay, and Thornfield Manor had been transformed from a Gothic monument to grief into something that hummed with life and laughter, the kind of transformation that was visible in every corner in the rose gardens that now bloomed in profusion under Eleanor's devoted care, and in the halls where children's voices echoed as their two daughters chased each other through rooms that had once known only cold silence. In the library where Adrian and Eleanor still spent their evenings, but now sat together on the same sofa rather than in separate chairs, their fingers intertwined as they read or simply talked about the small details of their days, and most of all in Adrian's eyes, which had lost that glacial quality and now held warmth when he looked at his wife, a tenderness so profound that the servants who had witnessed their beginning sometimes shook their heads in wonder at how completely love had rewritten what revenge had begun. Eleanor stood at the window of the drawing room on an autumn afternoon, much like the one when their relationship had first begun to shift, watching as Adrian played with their daughters in the garden, lifting the youngest onto his shoulders, while the elder one demanded he catch her too. And she smiled at the scene, because this man who had once weaponized coldness now gave affection with the wholehearted devotion of someone who understood its value, precisely because he had lived so long without it. And she thought of the girl she had been, accepting a loveless marriage as penance for her father's sins, and marveled at how that broken beginning had led to this, not despite the pain, but somehow because of it, because they had both been forced to grow in ways that comfort would never have demanded, to develop the kind of courage that only comes from having everything to lose and choosing to risk it anyway. Dear listener, perhaps you wonder whether such a story is possible in your own life, whether love can truly grow from soil poisoned by resentment and watered with tears, whether people can transform so completely that their endings bear no resemblance to their beginnings. And the truth that Eleanor and Adrian discovered is this: redemption is never a single moment, but a series of small choices made daily, hourly, in the moments when it would be easier to retreat into old patterns, but you choose instead to remain vulnerable, to remain honest, to remain present to the person you are becoming and the person you are learning to love. And yes, it requires courage from both parties, the courage to forgive what seems unforgivable, and the courage to believe you might be worthy of that forgiveness, the courage to trust again after trust has been shattered, and the courage to prove yourself trustworthy through patient consistency rather than grand gestures. The greatest revenge, they learned, was not to bind someone to suffering, but to choose forgiveness, to choose to build something beautiful from the wreckage, to demonstrate that love is stronger than bitterness and grace more powerful than vengeance. And if you are carrying the weight of past hurts or living with the consequences of choices you regret, know that transformation is possible, that endings can be rewritten, that the soil of your life, however damaged it may seem, can still produce beauty if you are willing to tend it with patience, with honesty, with the kind of vulnerable courage that refuses to let fear make your choices for you. May you find the strength to forgive what needs forgiving, and the wisdom to know when you are being offered genuine transformation rather than empty promises. May you have the courage to stay when staying is the harder choice, and the clarity to leave when leaving is the necessary one. And may you discover, as Eleanor and Adrian did, that the deepest love is not the easiest love, but the love that has been tested and refined and chosen again and again until it becomes as essential as breath. And may you rest well tonight, knowing that your story is not yet finished, that redemption is always possible, and that grace has a way of finding root in the most unlikely places if you are brave enough to let it grow. Until next time, this is Enchanted Quill, reminding you that every ending is also a beginning, and the most beautiful chapters of your life may be the ones you never saw coming. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of second chances.